Hearing is in the hybrid format, or witnesses are in person. Members have the option to appear in person or virtually. The committee meets today to consider 4 nominations: Dr. Sherrod Bernstein to be chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Dr. Ron Burzakowski to be director of financial research at the Department of Treasury, Mr. Solomon Green to be assistant secretary for policy development and research at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Mr. David Uigio to be assistant secretary for fair housing equal opportunity at HUD. We thank the nominees for appearing today and for their willingness to serve in each of you in these important roles. Just over 2 years ago, January 2021, this committee held a hearing to consider the nomination of Cecilia Rouse to chair the Council of Economic Advisors. At the time, our economy was at a crossroads. The country had experienced the deadliest month of the pandemic and a rise in new unemployment claims. Much has changed since then. For the first time in far too long, companies are investing in America again. We've seen investments in manufacturing critical technologies like semiconductors, solar production, EV vehicles. Last year, Ohioans celebrated the groundbreaking of a $20 billion semiconductor plant in Licking County, right outside of Columbus. It will create thousands of good-paying jobs. For the first time in decades, we're investing in infrastructure. Our bridges and roads and ports and trains and airports used to be the envy of the world. We're finally doing the work we need to modernize our infrastructure and keep our economy competitive. Inflation is moving in the right direction. And perhaps most important of all, workers are finally starting to gain a little power in our economy. Unemployment stands at 3.5%, the lowest rate in almost 50 years. Black unemployment rate has plummeted from more than 16% at the height of the recession of the pandemic to a record low 5% today. Since the beginning of this administration, 12 million jobs have been created, and a tight labor market means that more workers are finally able to demand to be paid what they're worth. More Americans, especially working class Americans, are finally getting the raises that they've earned. The unemployment rate between white and black Americans is the lowest it's been in 5 decades, the lowest it's been since we started collecting data. Let me say that again. The economic growth that began under President Obama, sidetracked by the global pandemic, has continued to advance under President Biden, with the result being that black unemployment is near all-time lows, and the gap between white and black unemployment is at the lowest point since this data has been tracked. As we continue this work to create an economy with a strong middle class that all have opportunities, all workers have the opportunity to join, CEA will continue playing an important role. While it's true members of the committee have often disagreed on policy, we have agreed that the president is entitled to have the choice of who he wants for CEA chair. I voted for Kevin Hassett, President Trump's choice to lead CEA in the committee and on the floor. Senator Crapo and I have talked about that many times. The Senate, in a bipartisan manner, went on to overwhelmingly confirm this nomination, 81-16. Again, a nomination with whom I had great disagreements on macro and microeconomic issues. Last Congress, Ranking Member Toomey voted for Cecilia Rouse. He had the same difference of opinion with her. The Senate confirmed that nomination 95-4. There's a long history in this committee, a long history of CEA nominations being voted on by voice in the committee and on the floor. I was part of that during the Bush administration. Sherrod Bernstein is the president's nominee to succeed Dr. Rouse as chairman of CEA. 4 decades of experience, Dr. Bernstein is an extremely qualified nominee with a distinguished record. That fact is evident when reviewing his committee questionnaire, over 130 pages in length. That's what this is. This isn't a compilation of articles. This is a compilation of a list of his articles to tell you how much information he has provided this committee. This is already in the record. I don't have to ask to do that again. But again, this is a list of the writings that this committee has asked for and received. I've served on this committee since 2007, my first day in the Senate. Dr. Bernstein's record is more extensive than any I've ever seen. He went to great lengths to provide the writings and statements the committee required. No nominee, I'd underscore, has come close to providing as much material as Dr. Bernstein. 4,000 published writings, 1,200 speeches, presentations, and public statements. As you would imagine, Dr. Bernstein is well respected by colleagues across the political spectrum. Last week, a group of 7 former CEA chairs who served in Republicans' administration wrote in support of his nomination. That's what enter this letter in the record without objection. Senator wrote in support of his nomination: Ben Bernanke, Michael Boskin, Glenn Hubbard, Gregory Mankiw, Kevin Hassett, Thomas Phillipson, Tyler Goodspeed. The last 3 all served in the Trump administration. Dr. Hassett led the effort for this letter that I mentioned. He told the New York Times, "I disagree with Sherrod about a lot, and Sherrod and I have been disagreeing about things for 20 years. But he really is a fundamentally good person who tries to figure things out with an open mind and who changes his mind. That kind of openness to ideas from anyone of any party or point of view is what we should want in an economic leader. He spent his entire career fighting to make our economy fairer so that working families' hard work can pay off. I'm sure that is why, despite concerns from some progressives, he voiced support for Senator Booker and Senator Scott's proposal for opportunity zones. He served as a member of CEA since the beginning of this administration. He served in various senior roles, including chief economist and economic policy advisor to then Vice President Biden, deputy chief economist at the Department of Labor, a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and an economist at the Economic Policy Institute. His credentials are unmatched. He has the experience, knowledge, and dedication to public service we need in a CEA chairman. I can't imagine any of my colleagues opposing him. Welcome to the committee, Dr. Bernstein. Dr. Ron Burzakowski is the President's nominee to be Director of Financial Research at the Department of Treasury. Some of my colleagues remember, as part of Dodd-Frank, the committee established this office to help identify and guard against risks that reach across the financial system and provide the FSOC and member agencies with the data they need to protect financial stability. I believe we all can agree, in light of the recent bank failures, how important it is that regulators and decision makers have the data they need to measure and appropriately respond to risks in our financial system. I think we all remember that Silicon Valley Bank did not have a chief risk officer, for instance. Not that it would be his job once confirmed, but what Dr. Burzakowski does is along those lines and very important. Consideration of his nominee is particularly timely. He's an exceptionally well-qualified nominee. For 19 years under both Democratic and Republican directors, he served as various roles in the Office of Research at the CFPB. There he helped support the Bureau's research and data efforts. Early in his career, he served as a senior economist at the Federal Reserve and Deputy Research Director for the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. He serves today as the Executive Director of Yale's Data Intensive Social Science Center. Welcome, Dr. Burzakowski. Glad to have you here today. Today we have the consideration we consider the nominations of 2 qualified HUD nominees, Solomon Green and David Uigio. Both Mr. Green and Mr. Uigio have long histories of public service. There have been attempts to distract from these nominees' qualifications. The record is clear. Their breadth of experience and the knowledge will help them lead HUD as the agency works to tackle the housing challenges, immense as they are, facing every community. Solomon Green is the President's nominee to serve as Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research. Since 2022, Mr. Green has served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at HUD. Prior to joining HUD, he served as a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, where he led research on housing and community development issues. Previously served as senior advisor at HUD and an adjunct professor at NYU's Wagner's Graduate School of Public Service. As head of policy development and research, he'll lead HUD's research and provide data to inform Congress and the agency as we discuss policy decisions. Welcome, Mr. Green. David Uigio is the President's nominee to serve as Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. That office is responsible for overseeing the implementation and enforcement of laws that protect homeowners and renters from housing discrimination. Mr. Uigio has strong management experience, currently the Acting Associate Director for Supervision, Enforcement, and Lending at CFPB. Previously, Mr. Uigio served as the Bureau's Acting Director, Acting Chief of Staff, and Chief Strategy Officer. Before joining CFPB, Mr. Uigio served in different roles at NIH, OPM, and DOD. Welcome, Mr. Uigio. Thank you again to all these nominees for your willingness to serve. I look forward to your testimonies today. And I'd like to welcome Senator Fetterman back to our committee. John, good to have you back. So, Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we are here to in furtherance of the Senate's solemn and constitutional role to provide advice and consent on presidential nominees. Nominees are intended to advise the president and serve as his or her designee by leading their respective department, agency, or division. And as leaders of our country, the greatest nation on earth, presidential nominees should inspire confidence and have a strong respect for the rule of law and support policies that promote the American dream. As public servants, we must all strive to serve the American people to the best of our ability. And in doing so, we must promote a strong economy and policies that serve the interests of everyday Americans working to achieve their version of the American dream. We do this by incentivizing growth and opportunity, not an administrative state full of regulatory burdens. Unfortunately, this panel before us today falls short of those goals. Today, we will hear from Dr. Sherrod Bernstein, to be the chairman of the CEA, Dr. Ron Borzakowski, and Mr. Solomon Green, as well as Mr. David Weggio. Sadly for our country, most of these men share a vision to remake our government into one that prioritizes handouts over hand-ups. They lack respect for our men and women in blue, and they have worked to promote an administrative agenda cloaked in secrecy and politics, rather than working through a transparent notice and comment process. These views and ideas aren't held by the majority of the American people, and they should not be reflected in America's leaders and the regulatory responsibilities they undertake. Time for my opening remarks is limited, but given the large panel, I would like to take just a few minutes to run through some of my chief concerns with each of the nominees before us today. First, President Biden has nominated Dr. Bernstein as the chair of the CEA. While Mr. Bernstein has made some positive comments about the opportunity zones, and I will certainly look forward to having a conversation about that during the Q&A. However, the American people probably know Mr. Bernstein best as a man who told them time and time again that inflation was transitory, who later had the audacity to say that the American people just didn't understand the definition of transitory, when inflation turned out not to be transitory, excuse me. It is mind-boggling to me that inflation is at a 40-year high, and yet the person who advised the president that inflation would be transitory is the very same person the president has nominated to be the chair of the CEA. It just doesn't make sense. Among other things, Mr. Bernstein has advocated for universal government guaranteed jobs, universal government run health care, higher taxes including a carbon tax, and more reckless government spending, the new Green Deal, dropping our commitment to maintaining the dollar as a reserve currency, and remaking the Federal Reserve an independent body to focus not on the dual mandate, but more specifically on unemployment by race. He has championed the cause of climate alarmists at the expense of working families, writing that the price of fossil fuels should be higher, given the increasing awareness of the urgency of climate change. He even criticized the low gas prices during the previous administration, claiming that it should be higher given its negative environmental effects. Not only have Mr. Bernstein's economic policies and the views proven to be inaccurate, some are simply counter to Americans' best interest. In addition to Mr. Bernstein, this committee must once again consider Mr. Green and Mr. Weggio. Mr. Green and Mr. Weggio were here last year during the last Congress. Both failed to receive a confirmation vote, and I think it's important for us to understand why. Mr. Green has made numerous public statements disparaging the police and advocating for defunding the police. Because of his extreme anti-police statements, 2 national police groups have publicly opposed Mr. Green's nomination since he was first nominated in 2021. Worse yet, instead of taking responsibility for making such statements, he pointed fingers and apologized for our taking offense, attempting to deny his anti-police sentiment. I'm a guy who spent a lot of time and many years working on police reform. And when you look at the comments clearly there's nothing hyperbolic about the position that I'm taking as it relates to the concept or the statement that Mr. Green would really not be that dissuaded from finding ways to use the money for the police officers, particularly in some of the most devastated communities, for something else. And I will recall that this is round two for Mr. Green and I having the conversation about the importance of police in the poorest communities in the country, as neither one of us will be surprised that in August of last year, we had the same, 2021, we had the same conversation about the importance of having law enforcement and their presence increasing in some of the most devastated, crime-ridden areas of our country. Having grown up in a single-parent household in poverty and being all too familiar with the negative impact that happens in so many of these devastating areas, I think some things are not political. Some things are just so personal that it is impossible to deny the actual impact of fewer officers, not more officers, in some of the most challenging areas. And so I take great offense on behalf of those who today suffer under the weight of crime that is burdening their communities. You think about here in the D.C. area where rape is up over 100%. You think about New York City, Los Angeles, Cleveland, and so many other places around the country where the weight of crime is now locking grandparents in their houses from the time the sun goes down until it comes up. And so for me, this is such an important issue that having someone in the role over the Housing Urban Development Committee in any way, shape, or form who doesn't seem to appreciate the importance of law enforcement's presence is just a challenge and makes it impossible for me to vote for someone like that. Like Mr. Green, Mr. Weggio's nomination also failed last Congress. Despite protestations to the contrary, the record is clear. Mr. Weggio is unqualified to serve as an Assistant Secretary of the Department of HUD. More importantly, the reported actions of forcing out senior career civil servants so that Director Chopra at CFPB could fill those positions with hand-picked loyalists, including Mr. Weggio himself, are troubling. We must all strive to lead by example, and I cannot justify confirming a nominee who may have unfairly secured his current role as a means of padding his resume for his pending, albeit languishing, nomination. And finally, Mr. Brzezinski has been nominated to serve as the Director of the Office of Financial Research of the Department of Treasury. He has a doctorate in economics and unquestionably is academically qualified. And though his record lacks really glaring concerns, I look forward to hearing more about your positions and learning more about you carrying out your responsibilities and duties in a fair, empirical, and apolitical fashion if confirmed. After all, the Office of Financial Research should not be used to manipulate financial data, standards, and analysis to justify the progressive economic agenda of the Biden administration that seeks to unravel our free market economy and damage the livelihood of everyday Americans. I look forward to hearing from each of you.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Would the nominees please rise? Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Do you agree to appear and testify before any duly constituted committee of the Senate? Thank you. Please take your seats. If you'd like to introduce family members or friends with you today, I invite you to do that before the beginning of your testimony. Dr. Bernstein, you're recognized to begin your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Brown and Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee. It's an honor to come before you today as President Biden's nominee to serve as Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and I'm joined today by my wife, Kay Arndorfer, and my two of my daughters, Ellie and Kate. I began working for the President as an economic advisor when he was Vice President in 2009. I was honored when he asked me to join the CEA as a member of the administration and also by his recent decision to nominate me for the position of chair. I would not be here today were it not for the President's faith and confidence in my work along with our shared vision of an economy that provides opportunities for everyone from all walks of life to reach their full potential. I would also not be here today without the support of my family. My father, a veteran of the Second World War, has long been an inspiration to me, even though he died when I was 7 years old from a kidney disease he contracted during the war. He came from extremely humble beginnings and was the first member of his family to go to college, eventually going on to earn a PhD in physics. This path would have been closed to him were it not for the GI Bill, and he made sure his children knew how important that policy was to his and to our lives. After he died, my mother supported me and my two sisters through her job as a public school teacher and by working weekends as a waitress to help make ends meet without my father's salary. Though I'm sure I wasn't thinking about it in economic terms at such a young age, the importance of a paycheck was embedded in my young consciousness. Though my early career was in music, I never lost sight of the role of government policy and strong labor markets to provide economic opportunity. As a resident of New York City in the 1970s and 80s, I personally observed a period of rising inequality and, quote, sticky poverty rates, meaning rates that were unresponsive to overall economic growth, and increasingly realized how important it was to try to help those less privileged than myself. That led me into social work, and I spent a number of years as a social worker in New York City. In one formative experience, I vividly remember working with an older veteran of both World War II and Vietnam. He clearly needed further medical support, but after giving so much to his country, was not able to access the services he needed and deserved. This experience was deeply troubling and fed my desire to want to intervene on a more systemic basis. This led me to a PhD program at Columbia University that addressed social welfare problems using the analytic and policy tools of economics. Were it not for the rigor of that program, as well as the guidance of my dissertation advisor, Erwin Garfinkel, I would likely not have the honor of coming before you today. As I was writing my dissertation in 1992, I came to Washington to work for a year at the Economic Policy Institute, where I would co-author my first book, The State of Working America, with labor economist Lawrence Michel. Based on the quality difference between DC and New York bagels and pizza alone, I assumed I'd soon be back in New York. But my work with Dr. Michel on the importance of strong labor markets to working American families was so compelling that I stayed on at EPI and eventually co-authored 9 editions of The State of Working America. Far more important, however, was the life-changing moment in 1994 when I met my wife, Kay Arndorfer, who's here today along with 2 of our daughters, Kate and Ellie. In what I fear was a weak effort to impress Kay on our very first date, I showed her an early print edition of State of Working America. Since then, my family has been an unceasing source of support in my work and personal life. I believe that all of these experiences, as well as working for Chair Rouse these past 2 years, has left me in a uniquely strong position to, if confirmed, chair the CEA. I'm committed to carrying on the work we've done, including careful analysis of the data flow on behalf of the President and the senior staff, the writing of our annual economic report of the President, participation in administrative-wide policy processes, and providing top-level advice to the President on economic policy. If confirmed, I also look forward to continuing Chair Rouse's efforts to ensure the diversity and the excellence of CEA's staff. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bernstein. Dr. Borzakowski, you're recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's an honor to appear before you as the President's nominee to serve as Director of the Office of Financial Research. With me today are my wife, Dina, my partner for over 40 years, and my children, Emma Rose, Benjamin, and Ruby. My mother-in-law is here too, beaming on her own and representing the pride that I'm sure my parents would feel at this nomination. I want to publicly thank my whole family and my community for their support and encouragement during my previous public service and for their future sacrifice if I'm fortunate enough to be confirmed in this new role. Both of my parents were survivors of the Shoah and came to the United States with nearly nothing, seeking to rebuild their lives and to restart their family lines. My father first worked in a series of factories and then as a small business owner. My mother worked first as a social worker and then as a homemaker, meticulously taking care of our home and family. Later, nightly, at our dinner table in a middle-class suburb of New York, that was the place to discuss the issues of the day. In retrospect, my parents' deep interest in the public affairs of their adopted land may be the origin of my own dedication to well-supported and reasoned policy. School took me west to California, where I studied math and political science, and after a short career as an actuary, I earned a master's degree in public policy. I followed that with a PhD in economics and a first research job at the Federal Reserve Board, studying the structure of the financial system and later issues of financial stability. I was thrilled to start my postgraduate career in public service, and I still remember my parents' pride when I shared that news. In the aftermath of the financial crisis and the Great Recession, I worked with my colleagues at the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, helping to analyze and record the causes and history of that crisis. I then joined the Office of Research at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, drawn by the mission and the opportunity to put research and evidence at the center of this new government organization. As you know, at the same time, Congress established the Office of Financial Research to serve the Financial Stability Oversight Council, its member agencies, and the public. One of the key findings from our work researching the crisis was that hardworking Americans suffered massive costs. The OFR's critical mission should be focused on ensuring that this does not happen again. Collecting, standardizing, and making accessible financial data, conducting and sponsoring research related to financial stability, and developing new tools for risk measurement and risk monitoring should all be in line with that central purpose. This mission implicitly recognizes the inherent economies of scale in collecting and managing data. It also recognizes the benefits of a more coordinated regulatory system. And a successful OFR will improve government, lessen the chance of a financial crisis, and benefit both the public and private sectors. If confirmed, I look forward to working with this committee and with members of the Council to achieve these worthy goals. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Borzkowski. Mr. Green, you're recognized.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and distinguished members of the committee, I am deeply honored to appear before you today as you consider my nomination to serve as the Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at HUD. I want to begin by thanking President Biden and Secretary Fudge for the confidence they placed in me by nominating me for this important position. I would also like to thank my family for their love and unwavering support. Senators, Secretary Fudge often says that bringing people home is at the heart of everything we do at HUD. It is also at the heart of my life's work. I have dedicated my career to helping families find and keep stable and affordable housing. This is something I grew to appreciate from an early age. I was raised primarily by a single mother who earned so little while working full-time as a nurse that we received Medicaid and food stamps. By economic necessity, my family often moved to where we could afford the rent until my mother was able to scrimp and save just enough for a down payment on a house in a rural county in upstate New York. That house and that property, where my mother still lives today with my brother, his wife, and my baby nephew, provided the stability I needed to be able to focus on school and my future. I truly believe it is why I'm able to sit here today as a nominee. These early experiences also instilled in me the recognition that a home is more than a roof over your head. It is also a platform for health and well-being and a down payment on your children's future. Throughout my career, I have strived to give every family the opportunities I was given. The American dream is that no matter who you are or where you come from, if you work hard and give it your all, you will succeed. I have dedicated my career to ensuring that where you come from does not determine who you can become later in life. HUD's mission to create strong, sustainable, and inclusive communities and ensure quality homes for all embodies that promise. And my contribution to fulfilling this promise has been to support innovative, evidence-based, and data-driven housing policies at all levels of government. For years, I've worked with federal, state, and local leaders to design and test policies and programs to produce and preserve affordable housing, to revitalize communities, expand neighborhood choices, and boost upward mobility. Most importantly, for the position to which I have been nominated, I am passionate about using the best available evidence to inform public policy decisions. I am first and foremost a researcher with a strong and proven commitment to evidence-based policymaking. I've demonstrated this through over 2 decades of work on data-driven and community-informed housing policy. From the very start of my career, working in local government and for a community-based affordable housing developer, as a graduate student in law and urban planning, as a legal research fellow and adjunct professor at NYU, during over 7 years as a senior researcher at the Urban Institute, and now in my current role at HUD. In all my work, I have applied independent, unbiased, and objective research to help ensure our public policies are rooted in evidence, maximize the impact of limited resources, and respond to the realities of people and communities on the ground. I am also passionate about bringing together researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to identify evidence-based and data-driven solutions to our nation's most pressing housing and community development challenges. I firmly believe that rigorous research can provide diverse stakeholders a common frame through which to assess problems and a shared foundation to find solutions. Senators, we are at a moment in our nation's history when HUD's mission is more important than ever. It is a mission I have endeavored to support with evidence, innovation, and compassion from the very start of my career. I would be deeply honored and grateful for the opportunity to serve as HUD's 17th Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Uwizio, you're recognized.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm joined here by my wife, Myra, my daughter, Vivi, and my son, Maxwell. Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee. I'm honored to appear before you again today as the nominee for the Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I want to thank President Biden for the trust and confidence he has placed in me by nominating me for this position. I would also like to thank my family and friends for their steadfast support during the 17 years I have spent as a career civil servant. I particularly want to thank my wife, who has believed in me every step along the way, and our 2 wonderful children for their love and inspiration. I have seen firsthand the unparalleled opportunity offered by the American dream. My great-grandparents arrived in this country with nothing, building their first house in rural Hawaii with their own hands. Our family also faced down the challenge of discrimination. My granduncle was interned in 6 different states during World War II before reuniting with his wife and children in Hawaii. Though there were challenges, those generations worked hard for their piece of the American dream and to pass on greater opportunity to their children than they had for themselves. For my family and for so many others, access to stable housing served as an engine of prosperity, providing a safe roof over our heads and a chance to build equity at the bank. Over the past 17 years, I have been blessed to serve the American people as a career civil servant at the National Institutes of Health, the Pentagon, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Over that time, I have been called upon repeatedly to stand up or reinvigorate agencies to solve complex problems, preventing them from delivering for the American people. I have deep expertise in leading, designing, and strengthening federal programs, offices, and processes. In my 11 years at the CFPB, I have had the opportunity to work as Chief Strategy Officer for directors from both parties to implement their policy and operational priorities. And in January of 2021, the President asked me to serve in the capacity of Acting Director of the Bureau. During my 10 months leading CFPB, I moved swiftly to address consumer harm amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. I adopted a laser-like focus on housing insecurity as housing is a cornerstone issue for the financial stability of America's consumers. Under my leadership, the Bureau used all available policy tools to require that struggling homeowners had access to every opportunity to stay in their homes and to ensure tenants eligible for protections were apprised of their rights. I doubled the number of fair lending examinations the Bureau conducted, with a particular focus on redlining and other discriminatory practices in the mortgage market under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and its implementing Regulation B, the Fair Housing Act's parallel in the consumer credit market. Since that time, I have led the law enforcement and compliance work of the CFPB, enforcing fairly and impartially the laws Congress has written to protect American consumers. I've overseen more than 700 nationally distributed staff who are tasked with undertaking hundreds of compliance examinations and enforcement investigations or actions under the 20-plus consumer laws and implementing regulations that Congress has assigned the CFPB to enforce. As we commemorate the 55th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act this month, I am deeply humbled to be nominated to carry out its statutory purpose to protect all Americans from discrimination in housing so that every family can claim their piece of the American dream. Discrimination in housing has evolved in profound ways over the years. Housing discrimination is no longer explicitly codified in federal mortgage policy or enforced via exclusionary racial covenants. But we now live in a world where access to housing is increasingly defined by algorithmically generated indicators in credit scoring and tenant screening, which themselves could bake in discrimination or exclusion in ways that are insidious and difficult to detect. And as Main Street communities across our nation grapple with how to meet their housing needs, Wall Street investors are eyeing those same neighborhoods for short-term profits. And not everything has changed. While many of the methods of housing discrimination may have shifted, we are no closer to closing the black-white home ownership gap than we were when the act was signed into law. Amidst a precipitous shortfall in housing supply, too many Americans are finding themselves unable to guarantee safe and stable housing for their families. If confirmed, I would execute FHAO's mission under Secretary Fudge with transparency, integrity, and impartiality, and I would look forward to working with this committee to ensure fair access to housing for all Americans. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ruggiero. Dr. Bernstein, start with you. For many Ohioans that I hear from, yesterday I was in East Palestine again, for instance, prices for groceries and rents remain far too high. The cost of living, raising a family have been rising for decades. Inflation stemming from the pandemic and from Putin's war in Ukraine remains a challenge at home and abroad. While we've seen prices come down in recent months, Americans are searching for more relief. Dr. Bernstein, would you describe briefly how you view inflation at this time, how your views have evolved on the subject over time, and what Congress can do to help the administration tackle this?
Thank you, Senator. As you very correctly suggest, inflation is a global challenge. The rates of inflation are now double in the European Union and the UK than they are here. They're closer to 10%. We're around 5%, and that 5% is down from its most recent peak of over 9% last June. The fact that inflation has been global, despite different policy agendas across different countries, provides an important reminder that its overriding cause was, as you suggest, first the pandemic and then later the war. That is, countries all had different fiscal and monetary responses, but they all had fast rising inflation. And while we still have ground to make up, as noted, our inflation's fallen much faster than either in the EU or the UK. Now, inflation is a function of strong demand, especially for goods. It was during the pandemic, as well as damaged supply chains. In answer to your question of actions that we've taken, one of the first things we did out of the box was to try to repair damaged supply chains, improve the logistics therein, and increase the flow of goods across the globe. That work has been quite successful. Supply chains are much repaired from where they started, and in fact, core goods prices have been negative or about zero for the last 6 months. Finally, fiscal and monetary policy since 2020 contributed to demand, but it also helped us to get to the other side of the crisis. The rescue plan, in particular, got shots in arms, checks in pockets, setting up an historic recovery with a labor market that, as you said in your opening statement, has made some remarkable gains. Hundreds of millions of people received vaccination, child poverty cut by half, the first national eviction prevention program, small businesses getting to the other side of this recovery and posting record entrepreneurial gains in this period, and of course, a real GDP level that's 5% above its pre-pandemic level and well above that of the G7. So I think that balanced view hopefully covers both our understanding of inflation, actions we've taken to ameliorate its pressures, as well as some of the very positive, important growth effects that everyday people are benefiting from.
Thank you for that answer. Mr. Green, prior to your hearing in 2021, you wrote the committee. You unequivocally stated you do not support defunding the police. You testified in 2021 under oath that you do not support defending the police. Put this issue to bed once and for all. Again, under oath, do you support defunding the police?
I do not support defunding the police, Chairman Brown.
Have you ever advocated for, do you support defunding DOJ, the FBI, or federal law enforcement?
No, I have not.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I talk about defunding the police today is a distraction. My colleagues know that. The chart that the ranking member held up, we're not your words understanding that. The witnesses have stated under oath that this witness does not support defunding the police. But what's ironic on this is these political attacks endure in presidential races and Senate races, wherever. What's interesting is that it's Democrats who funded the police. The American Rescue Plan enabled communities around the country to keep cops on the job through the pandemic. Democrats voted for the American Rescue Plan. Republicans, to the person, opposed funding local and state police in our communities. Republican politicians today in the House and Senate are actually calling for defunding law enforcement, defunding the FBI, defunding DOJ. Prominent Republican politicians continue to do that while accusing Democrats of something that Democrats simply haven't advocated for. If you care about law enforcement, you support them in word and deed, period. Now, my last question for Mr. Bordzkowski. You have significant experience leading and managing economic research organizations. Briefly describe how your experience has prepared you for this role and how you approach evaluating risk to our financial system.
Thank you for the question, Chairman Brown. I think, given that time, I'll do this very briefly, but my role at the CFPB in particular was to build a research office for a brand new government agency, and that meant gathering the data resources, hiring the personnel that were necessary, putting in the correct policies, procedures, and safeguards for those data, all to make sure that we could do the analysis, provide those at the time to Director Cordray and later to Acting Director Mulvaney and Director Kraninger so that they can make the policy decisions the Bureau needed. And that was primarily my role over that period of time.
Okay, thank you. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will simply say that anyone who thinks that Republicans have not been the leading voices on funding the police and that Democrats have been the leading voices to defund the police, don't ask us, ask the police. Look around the country and see the devastating state of crime in America. Don't ask us, ask the people of the country who sides with the police and who does not. I will simply say that, Mr. Green, those are your comments. Those are your retweets. We would love to get you or Twitter to provide us with all your retweets or your tweets. We could have a serious conversation about that. But I'm not going to politicize that issue because I think there are other issues that are incredibly important. We will not see eye to eye on that issue. So let's talk about something that I think is equally important to those folks living in HUD homes. On April the 7th, despite bipartisan support from both sides of Congress to overturn the regulation, President Biden vetoed a resolution that would have reversed the EPA's WOTUS rule. In addition, this regulation will have a massive impact on farmers, ranchers, and small businesses across the country. I'm extremely concerned about the fact that potential impacts that this will have on affordable housing as well. This rule will require federal assessments on construction sites across the country, by expanding federal authority over drainage ditches, water tanks, irrigation systems. Virtually every association responsible for building affordable housing, they're all ringing the alarm bells about how this regulatory overreach will create massive delays and higher costs. Would you agree with those organizations? Mr. Green.
Thank you, Ranking Member Scott. So I've dedicated much of my career to expanding.
And mostly because I only have 2.5 minutes
expanding the supply of affordable housing, including conducting research and removing regulatory barriers. In my experience, and I think based on the research, most of the barriers that impede the supply of housing are state and local overly restrictive state and local land use reforms. I am generally familiar with the EPA actions you've described, but not enough to be able to provide an answer as to what
Let me
they're going to
ask
have
you a shorter question then. Do
Yeah.
you think the federal government should be regulating every ditch in America?
I do not.
Okay, good enough for me. Dr. Bernstein, I enjoyed reading about your family's history. I think it's a powerful testament to the American dream and truly appreciate that. I'd love to ask you just a few yes/no questions as often as we can get to the yes/no quickly. We both will benefit from that. Generally supportive of opportunity zones?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, sounds great. One of the comments that you've made about inflation, I would, of course, take exception to the fact that the inflation was basically the byproduct of first COVID and finally the war. I would just suggest that as it relates to gas prices, about before the Putin invasion of Ukraine, gas prices were up about 60% here in our country. And so I would not put the burden of inflation simply on those two. I would also add on top of that $4 trillion of federal spending that led to the 9.1% inflationary effect. Something that you said in the Washington Post piece that you wrote in 2020, so that anyone who voted for the TCJA has zero credibility on deficits and should summarily be ignored, if not ridiculed. That would, of course, include every single Republican that's going to have a choice in voting for you or not. Do you continue to stand behind that statement? And the one thing I'd add on top of that is that after being a part of the team that wrote the bill, we saw in 2018, revenues to the Treasury went up, not down. So that would actually improve, not reduce the likelihood of us making our bills. And number two, in 2019, add another 3% on top of the 3%. So therefore, with lower taxes, revenues to the Treasury actually went up. So do you still think that Republicans should be ridiculed for the support of that?
So I certainly don't. And I also think it's very important to look at the context of comments like that. So contextually, one of the point that I was making was that if you look at the main factor that's been driving up both deficits and debt, it is clearly diminished revenues. And the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act definitely played a role in diminishing revenues flowing to the Treasury. You can find a quarter or two that supports your interpretation.
Yes, sir.
But it is widely, let me just finish. It is widely understood
I have
to be
less
the case
time left, so I'm just going to tell you
that the revenue factor is as
Dr.
I described.
Bernstein, let me ask you one more question.
Sure.
So 4 quarters are what you have in 12 months. And 4 quarters, 12 months later, we had an increase in revenue, not a decrease in revenue. Then another 4 quarters in a row, we had another increase in revenue, not a decrease in revenue. So therefore, I would say that it's not a quarterly snapshot. It's actually a 12 months period of time where we saw more revenue coming to the Treasury, not less money coming to the Treasury.
This is not a controversial issue, Senator.
I agree with you on that part. So let me ask you my next
widely
question. Let me ask you my
agreed
next
upon.
question, by the way. You also said in 2017 Washington Post piece that Republicans are good at getting elected, lousy at governance. Do you continue to stand by that statement?
Again, I think that lifting statements out of context can lead to things that certainly don't describe my views.
But you would understand why I would find these statements to be concerning because let me just read
absolutely.
it again.
If I can respond. My entire professional career has been dedicated to working with people across the aisle to do precisely what you said in your opening comments was to lift up the the economic opportunities to everyday Americans, hand ups over handouts.
Yes.
It's why I worked on opportunity zones with the Trump administration. It's why the letter from Republican former CEA chairs endorsed my nomination. And so I look forward, if confirmed, to continuing to working with you on policies that do precisely what I think meet both of our goals in that regard.
I'll look for that as well. I would just suggest for you and future noms that while we're going to have strong disagreements on politics and perhaps philosophy, and we probably should because we don't see the world from the same vantage point, that's okay.
Yeah.
But to suggest that in the time of we live today that people should be ridiculed, taking that out of context, maybe, but probably not. I just think we should be very careful on how we I try not to demonize the other side.
I agree with you,
I'm not talking about anybody personally. I'm just talking about politics.
I agree with you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Warner of Virginia is recognized from his office.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Bernstein, it's good to see you again. And I've worked with you literally for years and very much appreciate the fact that I think you bring an open mind to all issues. You and I have not always agreed on a whole host of issues, but I think your record, the fact that you've got virtually every living former chair of the Council on Economic Advisors, all of those former Republican CEA heads, I think speaks volume. And I think anyone that would take a fair look at the extent of your record and how you work on issues like opportunity zones, and I was proud to work with Senator Scott on opportunity zones. I think the implementation still left a lot to be desired, and I hope I can work with Senator Scott and Senator Booker and others on how we can, if we were to renew it, how we get it right. But I think we've got a strong record. I want to get to a couple questions quickly. One, housing. I appreciate the chairman's focus on housing. We all know that prices and rents go up tremendously. I think in Virginia, it now takes somebody to get a one-bedroom apartment. You'd have to work 78-hour work week to be able to pay your rent. That just doesn't make sense. You know, I want you to speak about affordable housing, but with particularly focus on things like the low-income housing tax credit, the neighborhood homes tax credit that Senator Portman and Senator Cardin had, you know, the new market tax credit. How can we use these tools and others to juice housing supply? I think it's critically important.
Yeah. Are you asking, just to be clear, you asking me that question, Senator?
Yeah, I'm asking you. Yes.
Because there's other housing folks here. I strongly agree with what you're suggesting there. And the housing team of which I serve on in the Biden administration has exclusively, I shouldn't say exclusively, has largely focused on improving the supply of housing in ways that you've been working on for as long as you've been here. So not only does our agenda hope to close the gap between housing demand and housing supply, it hopes to do so through policies like the Capital Magnet Fund, the Housing Trust Fund, and yes, in our budget we have significant increases in the low-income housing tax credit. And I think that policy has a particularly strong appeal right now, and I would strongly urge Congress to give that a close look. If confirmed, would be really excited and happy to work with you and this committee on legislating those proposals.
Yeah, and I hope that you will be confirmed, and I look forward to working with you on that. I want to touch as well on something I raised with the chairman of the Fed in recent hearings. You know, we know that the commercial real estate market is going through massive dislocation. There's close to $6 trillion, I believe, in commercial debt that is outstanding. A lot of that is related to the real estate market. You know, we've seen the refinancing woes in the past. With cliffs coming, and somehow we always manage to get through them. I do worry this time with inflation up and with the fundamental transition going on in the office market. And I do believe we need to encourage more of our workforce, federal workers, private sector workers, to get back into the office. I know some can work efficiently at home, but I do think overall operations are better. But this commercial real estate debt overhang, Is this time going to be different in terms of the rollover on that commercial debt? I'm hugely worried that we could have a real meltdown now. That thrown in top of what's happening on some of the follow-on effects of the SVB and other banking tightening. Talk about this commercial.
Sure.
Overhang.
Briefly, Senator, that is a relevant, germane concern. Certainly, occupancy rates remain well below their pre-pandemic levels. And while we've seen any delinquencies in this space rise a bit lately, they're still really quite low in historical terms. That said, this issue is very much on our watch list. It's something we're tracking carefully. To a non-trivial extent, many holdings of commercial real estate are held by smaller and middle-sized banks. I think just in completing my thoughts on this for now, there's more to be said here. I think some of the actions that were taken, decisive actions were taken the weekend that SVB and Signature failed, have really helped to stabilize the system, and this too should help ameliorate the stressors that you're describing, but they are definitely worth keeping a close eye on, and we will do so at CEA.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Warner. Senator Rounds of South Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Bernstein, I have to admit, I really appreciated the opportunity to visit with you in my office, and thank you for taking the time to do so. There were a couple of items that we talked about there that I would suspect that we would disagree on, but I want to work my way through them with you here today. Inflation, specifically the high energy prices, I believe have negatively affected American families. I also believe that the Federal Reserve does not have the appropriate tools to fight this inflation because it is policy-induced by President Biden's plans. On President Biden's first day in office, with a stroke of a pen, he choked off the access to the Keystone XL pipeline and prohibited new oil and gas leases on public lands and waters. This sent a signal to the energy community, those people that invest in energy, that the federal government would be diverting resources away from domestic energy production. As a member of the CEA, did you recommend that action, that he shut down that Keystone pipeline on that first day?
First of all, let me very much agree that meeting with you and talking about these issues was a pleasure. And I hope that in that meeting I underscored the kind of dynamics that the CEA former Republican chairs referenced about my proclivities to work with folks across the aisle and to value inputs from a diverse set of views. That's a quote. I think the important points that I tried to stress with you were less about Keystone and more about crude production under President Biden, which has been higher than any other president on record.
The reason why I'm asking is because on that particular day, the president relies on advice from trusted advisors around him. I would have assumed that you would be one of those trusted advisors. So that's the reason why I asked. Did you recommend to him that he shut down the Keystone XL pipeline?
I am always involved in policy processes, but I don't have a readout from that precise incident. I will point out that the Keystone pipeline was only 8% completed when the decision to cancel it was made. And of course, that was merely that was a pipeline to transmit oil, not to produce more. And again, I think the key point here is that at 11.
And I don't mean to be argumentative, but my question is simply: did you recommend that he shut down the Keystone XL pipeline?
And my answer, Senator, was as a member of the team, I was part of those conversations, but I don't have any particular readout or recollection of that would answer that question in the fulsome manner you're requesting.
Well, then let me go on then, because I in your role as the chair of the CEA, how would you advise the president to bring down inflation from a policy perspective?
Okay, that's a great question, and I would say one of the answers is one I already referenced in discussions with Senator Brown earlier, which is the pandemic while not the sole cause of inflation, was certainly its root cause. And helping to ameliorate the supply side constraints that have been such a key factor in putting upward pressure on inflation was something we took very seriously and continued to do so. Our supply side disruption task force got right to work helping to bring down the logjam at the ports. And as I mentioned earlier, goods price inflation has actually been zero or negative over the past 5 or 6 months. In terms of energy, which I know is so important to you and your state, there I think it's important to recognize that production of oil under President Biden, 11.6 million barrels per day, is highest under any presidents thus far. And that the president just approved, as you know, the Willow Project, which will produce 180,000 barrels per day. We know that there are unused leases ready to be drilled and that our oil producers have been highly profitable.
Fair enough to say that the cost of energy, the cost of fuel has driven inflation up?
It's definitely not that simple, and in fact, in recent time, it's gone the other way. So in the month of March,
actually, since President Biden's taken office, the price of gasoline on a per gallon basis is still about $1.30 per gallon higher than what it was when he took office.
Well, interestingly, it's about $1.35 below where it was in the peak of June of last year when
it has been higher under his administration, but from the beginning of his administration forward, based upon advice that he's received, we've seen energy prices go up. And not all of it, in fact, a lot of it occurred prior to Mr. Putin invading Ukraine. And so the reason why I ask this is these are really important advisories. And the message that you and I had, the discussion that you and I had in my office the other day, was specific on the types of advice and the background that you would provide the president. And I know I'm over my time on this, but I just think it's really important that the committee here, the approach that you take in advising the President of the United States on economic issues of all sites. But I thank you for your time today, sir.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator Fetterman of Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Good to see you. Thank you.
And now, Mr. Green, now I know the chairman was really drilling down on it, but I just really want to put a sharper point on it. You do not embrace at all the defunding the police, correct?
I do not, Senator.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for being here today. And I know your nomination was brought in before this committee last Congress. And my predecessor made it prevented from you to be able to moving forward. Is that a fact?
That's correct.
Yeah. I personally wanted, looking forward to giving you a fair chance to discuss your policy work on its substance.
Thank you, Senator.
And with Congress's historic investments in the infrastructure investment and the Jobs Act, we are beginning to see some real improvements in the quality of and the life of forgotten communities. And so, Mr. Green, has HUD been working with the Department of Transportation to coordinate on the implementation, the IIJA? If you were confirmed, could HUD help track housing costs around major infrastructure projects so we could develop targeted strategies to preserve affordability?
Absolutely, Senator. We are, as a country, benefiting from unprecedented investments in our nation's and overdue investments in our nation's infrastructure and transportation. At the same time, we are also facing a tremendous housing crisis, and there's an opportunity to leverage those investments to address the housing needs so desperate in so many communities. And we've already started that work at HUD with the Department of Transportation. We just earlier this year announced a Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Program to give local communities the support they need and help them build capacity to leverage those investments. Of course, we would continue to do so. We already have tools to measure and data to measure how changes in prices that may be associated with transportation infrastructure investments, and we can use our Thriving Communities TA to help communities use those data to make more informed decisions. So it's both a tremendous challenge, but I would say also a tremendous opportunity that we are eager to leverage.
Thank you. Dr. Bernstein, between the historic investments in the American infrastructure and manufacturing, we have seen in the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, we are witnessing a level of government investment in American infrastructure and manufacturing capacity that we have not seen in decades. Importantly, these investments are translated into real high-paid jobs for Pennsylvanians and working nationwide. So, Doctor, how can smart, proactive government investments in economic policy create high-paying, family-sustaining jobs for workers and expanding the middle class?
Well, thank you, Senator. Through precisely the types of investments that you've mentioned, but specifically by tapping the power of private markets so that we are working in tandem, that the government provides tailwinds to investments in areas where we've historically underinvested, both at great cost to our domestic production, but also to our national security. So the CHIPS Act is a classic example. We used to produce close to 40% of the world's computer chips. Now we're somewhere around 10%. And I would say the exposure of that shortfall was made very clear during the pandemic. So elevating the resiliency and the importance of those supply chains, whether it's chips or whether it's the production of clean energy, is very much a motivator for us. And again, just underscoring that, of course, this is not something we can do ourselves, Congress or any administration. We have to work closely with the private sector, and that's why I think we're so glad to be seeing some very strong reactions, whether it's investment in manufacturing, hundreds of billions coming in from the sidelines to complement the kinds of incentives that we've introduced in the bills you've mentioned.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thanks, Senator Fetterman. Senator Kennedy of Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Mr. Weggio, am I saying your name right, sir?
It's Weggio, Senator.
Weggio, thank you. You've been nominated for Assistant Secretary of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at HUD. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator, that is correct.
Tell me the difference between Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Fair Housing Act.
Certainly, Senator. My understanding is that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act deals principally with labor practices and employment practices, whereas the Fair Housing Act is principally focused on discrimination in housing, sir.
Okay. Is there a difference in the protected classes in the two statutes?
Thank you, Senator. I don't have a ton of experience with Title VII. I will say that the protected classes under the Fair Housing Act are well established as race, national origin, religion, familial status. I can name the rest if you'd like, Senator.
Okay. Tell me about Bostock v. Clayton County, the Supreme Court case.
Yes, Senator. So my understanding about Bostock was that it interpreted specifically the protected class in the Fair Housing Act dealing with sex and gender to include LGBTQIA individuals for those protections, and that was...
Excuse me if you're interrupting, but was Bostock an employment case or a housing case?
Senator, thanks for the question. I actually don't know the answer to that, Senator.
Well, it's kind of fundamental. I mean, what was the holding of Bostock?
My sense was that Bostock, as it's been interpreted by HUD, it made...
I'm not asking how HUD interpreted it. I mean, you've read the opinion. What does it say?
Sure.
It's an employment case, right?
My sense, Senator, I get what you're getting at with this questioning.
What am I getting at?
My sense is that this was a case... Well, I'm not a lawyer, Senator, and I have not had a good deal of experience with labor law. But the position I've been nominated for deals
Well,
with.
let me tell you what I'm getting at, okay? Bostock dealt with employment discrimination, okay? Its holding doesn't have to do with housing. Do you propose that the holding of Bostock be extended to housing?
Senator, my understanding is that HUD issued an interpretive rule.
I'm not asking about HUD. I know what HUD's done. I'm asking about you. Bostock, you say you've read it, and I believe you. If you have, you know it's an employment discrimination case, right?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. Do you think that the holding of Bostock can fairly be extended to the field of housing?
Senator, my view is that the role for which I've been nominated is to faithfully enforce the laws as Congress has written them and as they have been interpreted by the courts.
I'm asking you what the law is. I'm asking you what Bostock held, and do you think that Bostock can be extended to housing?
Senator, and I apologize if I'm missing the mark on your question. My sense is that Bostock held that the sex-prohibited basis or protected class under that set of laws under Title VII did include individuals who identify as LGBTQIA.
Well, here's what I'm getting at. Bostock was an employment discrimination case. All you got to do is read it. There it is, big as Dallas, okay? And HUD has said we're going to apply Bostock to housing. Not employment discrimination, to housing. And you're going to have to go along with that. Otherwise, you're not going to last very long on your job. So legally, how can that be done?
So, Senator, I don't presently work at HUD. I am familiar with the interpretive rule you've described.
I don't think you're going to answer me, and I'm going to run out of time. So let me ask Dr. Bernstein a question. Doc, why did you think inflation was temporary?
The word, of course, transitory is what you're referring to, and I not only believe, but I've said, and this is...
Well, is temporary and transitory, those are synonymous, right?
Yeah, those are they're synonyms. And
okay,
I think
well, tell me why...
But I think transitory was...
Tell me why you thought inflation... I'm going to be accurate. Why in your infinite wisdom, you thought inflation was transitory or temporary?
Well, let me be clear about what we meant at the time. And by the way, and this is contrary to what Ranking Member Scott said earlier, I did not ever say that people didn't understand transitory. What I said was we didn't understand transitory. In fact...
Well, that's clear. We can stipulate to that.
That word is temporally ambiguous. It meant different things. To some people it meant 2 weeks, to some people it meant 2 years. What we meant, and let me answer your question, we thought inflation was going to accelerate and gradually cool down over time. Now, that has turned out to be in fact, the pattern that inflation has taken. But transitory was much too ambiguous a description of that dynamic. Acceleration, cooling.
So now inflation is down from 9% to 5%. Are you telling me that when you said inflation was transitory, you were correct?
No, I'm not saying I was correct or incorrect. What I'm saying was that was an ambiguous...
Like you're saying you were correct.
No, I'm saying that was an ambiguous, an unclear word that was poorly chosen, I think, for that discussion because it meant different things to different people. To me...
Well, has it been transitory?
Inflation has, in fact, behaved much as I just described. We thought inflation was going to accelerate and gradually cool over time. And that is
Sherrod's going to cut me off. Has it been transitory?
Inflation has accelerated and cooled.
Senator's time's expired. I want to fulfill what you said, that I was going to cut you off.
Yeah.
Senator Van Hollen of Maryland's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations to all of you on your nominations. Dr. Bernstein, I have a question regarding employee ownership, because I'm working with some colleagues on a bipartisan basis to encourage private investment funds to finance the establishment and growth of employee-owned businesses. I think there's bipartisan agreement that when every employee has a stake in the success of an enterprise, that's a good thing we should encourage. And I know that this is something that you've devoted a lot of time to looking into and supporting. So could you just outline quickly for the committee the benefits of employee ownership?
Yeah, I think that this is a great question. Thank you, Senator. And it reminds me a little bit of the spirit of the opportunity zones that Senator Scott has worked on, in the sense that this is a way of trying to ensure that wealth reaches folks who it otherwise would not. So employment, ESOPs, or any kind of program that enables workers to become have some stake in the ownership of their companies is actually turned out to be a pretty surefire way to help rebalance the vast inequalities of wealth. We know income is unequally distributed. Wealth is far more unequally distributed. In fact, half of the population doesn't own any stock, and those that do, it's concentrated in the very top. So employee ownership programs are a great way to help break down that highly inequitable distribution.
Well, I appreciate that. As you know, and you've written about this, it can be very complicated right now for a business that wants to, become an employee-owned business to do that, which is why we're working on this legislation. Can I just have your commitment that, if confirmed to this position, that you would work with us in developing this legislation?
Oh, absolutely. I give you my full commitment that, if confirmed, I'll do so. And in fact, one of the areas I've tried to study is, why aren't there more arrangements like this? Because there should be, and the barriers you described, that's what we need to really drill down on.
Thank you. Yeah, we're trying to knock down those barriers. So, Dr. Borzakowski, great to have a fellow Marylander here. Congratulations on your nomination. I want to discuss the Office of Financial Research's role in identifying systemic risk. And as you know, part of your mission is to promote financial stability by looking across the financial system to measure and analyze risks and perform important research. All of this obviously hinges on data availability. And right now, as I look at the sort of non-banking financial system, there seems to be a great shortage of good information and data. And if, again, the shadow banking system and other financial companies that are not currently regulated in the same way as banks. So could you talk a little bit about the role of this office in trying to gather that information, whether you think that we should be doing more to gather data in that area to look at systemic risk?
Thank you, Senator, for the question and for the kind welcome from Maryland. I fully agree with you that the key mission of the OFR, if it's going to fulfill its mission to monitor for and be vigilant about systemic risks, is to build the data ahead of time, in particular into areas of the financial system that are not currently visible and for where we do not currently have data. The non-banking sector, as you've mentioned, is one of those areas. So in principle, I fully support efforts in that regard, and the statute gives the office the authority and the responsibility to do just that. While not being in the role currently, I'm a little bit at a loss exactly where they are in their current efforts in that regard, outside of the one current collection on that's under notice and comment for bilateral repo. But should I be lucky enough to be confirmed, I believe that collecting data on the areas of the financial system that we do not currently see is an important part of the mission.
Well, I appreciate that. I look forward to working with you in your office, because while there's been a lot of attention, as we know, on the banking system, even with the kind of information we currently collect, we've seen the risks like Silicon Valley Bank and others. But the shadow banking system is growing very rapidly. And when I asked the Secretary of Treasury and all the other federal regulators whether they support rolling back the limitations that the previous administration put on FSOC's ability to regulate there, the answer has been a unanimous yes from all of them. But we need to make sure that we gather more information here in order to make sure that we approach this regulation in a smart way. So I appreciate that. Congratulations to all of you.
Thanks, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Brett from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by saying it was wonderful to see Senator Fetterman here today. As a friend and a freshman colleague, it's great to have him back both in this committee room and here in the Capitol. Thank you for appearing before this committee today. We appreciate your time and your intentionality in answering our questions. I believe that this committee's role is that of oversight, and it's essential for holding leaders in our executive departments accountable for the decisions they make and policies they promote that affect all Americans, whether it be in our housing programs or our macroeconomic policies. America has seen inflation increase by 15.4% since President Biden came into office. As a mom of 2 school-aged kids, I see this firsthand every time I go to the grocery store or to the gas pump. Groceries are up 20% and energy costs are up 36%. Families in Alabama, South Carolina, Ohio, and in every community across the country are feeling that pain. Rising prices have cost that typical households, it's about $10,000 in 2 years. Families, parents, and retirees have had to bear the brunt of that persistent inflation over these last 23, 24 months. Dr. Bernstein, I wanted to talk to you following up on what Senator Kennedy was asking you. I know you've been asked once, but I want to make sure that we can clarify this. Do you still stand by your past comments indicating that inflation is transitory?
The problem with the word transitory is that it's become, I think, an unhelpful and much too ambiguous term to describe the trajectory of inflation. It is true that that word or any other word, temporary, any synonym, suggests a condition where inflation accelerates and then inflation decelerates. It slows down. Now, inflation peaked at 9% in June, and most recently was seen at 5%. That's its lowest annual growth rate since November of 2021. So in that sense, the view of acceleration then deceleration was correct. Transitory, however, was too temporally ambiguous a term.
Okay, so you do agree that that term should not have been used?
I think that the term was far too ambiguous to give people a clear sense of what we were thinking.
Yeah, and so one of the things we need you to do as a leader and someone who advises is give the public very clear indications of what we can expect. Unfortunately, the word transitory for many means temporary. It means that it would be short-lived. That's certainly not what we've seen. We've seen inflation above 5% every single month for 23 straight months, and real wages have gone down for 2 straight years. One of the things that Chairman Brown said about you and that was indicated in the letter is that you are open to changing your mind. So once again, just want to directly ask, that word transitory should have never been used.
I don't want to say it should never have been used. I think that the word is not a helpful term. I think it's too ambiguous. I think it doesn't clearly, it does not clearly delineate either what we believe to be the case or the actual trajectory. Now, that said, it is true that we saw inflation accelerate and we've seen inflation cool, but we have a lot more to go.
Would you agree that it's lasted longer than you anticipated when you first used that term?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Bernstein, you've also championed massive spending packages pushed by President Biden over these last 2 years, the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. You publicly said that they would decrease inflation. The hard truth is that these bills and policies have increased inflation, and the result in some saying that we may be having to have a recession in order to stem inflation. More spending is not the answer. To lower costs for all Americans, we have to stop the reckless spending, reduce regulatory burdens on job creators, and unleash American energy production so that we are not just energy independent, but energy dominant. President Biden has nominated you for the position of the chair of Council of Economic Advisors, of which you currently serve as a member of the council. 72% of Americans believe that the economy is headed in the wrong direction. And as one of the architects of the past 2 years of the failing economic policies of this administration, it is concerning to me that President Biden is asking the Senate to confirm you to this position. Last month, we saw President Biden propose his budget for fiscal year 2024 that includes a $6.9 trillion tax and spending spree that we know will continue to drive inflation even higher. All we have to do is look over the past 2 years for the evidence of that. I would ask you, how can the American people expect different results when this administration and its economic advisors tend to look like they're doubling down on what I believe has not worked?
So thank you for the question, Senator. I respectfully would like to challenge some of the the ways you've teed up some issues there. So first of all, the rescue plan was actually fiscally smaller than the CARES Act. So if that was massive, then the CARES Act was even more massive. The Inflation Reduction Act more than pays for itself. It actually reduces the budget deficit by over $200 billion over 10 years. In terms of the budget, the president's budget, once again, that not only pays for the proposals in the budget, but reduces the deficit by almost $3 trillion over 10 years. So I think that those characterizations go in a different direction than some that you were suggesting, respectfully.
And respectfully, I would disagree. I think if we were be producing more energy, if we were to be spending less money, I think inflation would not have been as quote-unquote transitory as you first put forth.
So if I may, Senator, the production of crude oil under President Biden is the highest.
I heard you say that earlier.
Is the highest under any president on record. In fact, under President Biden, on average, the production is 560,000 barrels per day, greater than under the previous administration.
And we see what's happening in Europe and the UK, and you've referenced that earlier. And if we were doing more to help them with their energy needs, I think that we would see those costs go down as well.
Thanks, Senator Britt. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our nominees for being here today. So the sudden failures of Silicon Valley and Signature Banks last month reminded us just how quickly risks that are lurking in our financial system can blow up, forcing regulators to take extraordinary action to stop panic and to protect our economy. It was a lesson hard learned in 2008, which is why Congress created the Office of Financial Research, or OFR, in the Dodd-Frank Act. Now, OFR is an independent office within the Treasury Department that was intended to serve as an early warning system to alert financial regulators to emerging risks, the idea is before it's too late. By collecting and analyzing critical data from across financial markets, OFR can give regulators and financial institutions the information they need to better monitor and address risks to the financial system wherever those risks occur. Dr. Borzakowski, you've been nominated to serve as the director of OFR, so let me ask you to explain the role OFR should play in monitoring and providing regulators with a better understanding of the kinds of financial stability risks that help take down SVB and Signature, like interest rate risk and concentrated deposits.
Thank you, Senator Warren, for the question and for your leadership. I know a lot of the financial issues post-crisis. As you know, we learned a lot in 2008 and 2009, or hopefully
and then forgot it.
To your question about the role of the OFR, I believe it begins, as you state, with looking across the landscape, trying to be vigilant in where risks may emerge. That takes some creativity because, by definition, I think, as you note, if they were hiding in plain sight, we would see them. So where could these risks emerge, and what data, therefore, should be gathered to confirm that hypothesis or negate it?
Right.
That data should be gathered, and it should be gathered ahead of any potential crisis, which is one of the other things we learned from 2008 and 2009. When things did start going wrong, it was a scramble to get the data necessary. So primarily, I believe it's that data, and then the complement to that is the research resources and analytic resources to turn those into insights and findings.
In fact, as I recall, OFR flagged the interest rate risk and other risks in the banking sector, and I assume you'd like to stay on top of that, if confirmed.
If confirmed, I feel it's my duty to fulfill the mission Congress laid out.
Yes, we'll do here. Yes, good. Yes. Congress gave OFR independence and powerful authorities to do its job to help ensure the safety of our financial system. The problem is, I think that OFR has fallen far short in its mandate for far too long. Now, one reason OFR has been so ineffective has been Republican sabotage. The Trump administration's OFR director narrowed the office's mission. He cut the staff by 60%. He slashed the budget by 25%. There is a particular irony in that because the OFR budget is not paid for by taxpayers. Its costs are actually paid by assessments on giant financial institutions. Dr. Borzakowski, if you're confirmed as OFR director, you will have the authority in consultation with Treasury Secretary Yellen to adjust fees on the biggest banks to ensure that OFR has the resources it needs to do its job. If confirmed, do you plan to adjust the fee structure to restore OFR's budget and staff?
Senator, if I am privileged enough to be confirmed, what I am committed to is the mission and to making sure that the OFR has both the staff and the resources and the data it needs to fulfill this critical mission.
So you're willing to readjust their fee structure and restore the budget and staff?
I'm willing to look at all of the tools
I'm
the OFR director
concerned that
has
I'm
granted.
not hearing just yes.
I am committed to looking at all of the resources. I can't speak to it right
That's
now.
a very troubling answer. Undoing the Trump administration's sabotage and restoring OFR's ability to do its job is, in my view, the critical first step, but OFR also has to be willing to use the tools that Congress gave it. Now, one of those tools is the ability to collect critical data from financial companies, which you've talked about earlier. For years, OFR has identified a variety of gaping holes in our data, missing information on climate risk, private funds, crypto, cybersecurity. Now, these data gaps matter because they prevent regulators from better understanding how these risks could blow up our financial system. Congress anticipated that some financial firms might be reluctant to share the data that on these risks that they're taking on. So we equipped OFR with subpoena power. Even so, in the 13 years since OFR was established, it apparently never once has used this authority. So this is why Senator Reid and I recently sent another letter to OFR asking it how it plans to collect the information needed to fill these data gaps. I realize I'm over. I want to ask one quick question. Dr. Borzakowski, OFR has made the explicit statutory authority, it has the authority to collect whatever information our regulators need, but we need leadership willing to use that authority. If confirmed, do you commit to using all of OFR's tools, including its subpoena power, to bring greater transparency to our financial markets and address these dangerous data gaps?
Senator, the statute lays out a number of ways for the OFR to collect data, including subpoena authority, and I commit to gathering the data in whatever way may be necessary using
That was
those
not
authorities
the question.
to fulfill the mission.
That was not the question. Do you commit to using all the tools you've got available?
I will use all
including
tools
subpoena?
available.
That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Haggerty of Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Bernstein, I'd like to start with you and talk about what I see as a very troubling trend that's been developing. It's been strengthening over the past several years. And that's the growing momentum and efforts of our allies and our adversaries to weaken the dollar's role as the international reserve currency. That includes Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin. I've got an article right here that I was just reading. Brazil's Lula calls for an end to dollar trade dominance. China applauds this. Even Malaysia sought to promote alternatives to the dollar. All of this, the CCP is applauding. And my first question to you is, do you agree that China wants to see this happen?
I think there's some evidence that it does.
It seems to be a great deal of evidence that it does. I think specifically, and we could talk about this from a strategic standpoint, why would China want to see this happen?
I think there are extremely important privileges and even in the realm of security, reasons to have the benefits from having the reserve currency. One of the most obvious is, of course, sanctions. If you control the reserve currency, you're able to impose sanctions, as we've done on Russia, to considerable effect. But there are other positive aspects as well.
I do see the positive aspects, and that's why I want to get into this next question, which has to do with some of your writings. And you've written a number of op-eds pushing for the U.S. to willingly cede the dollar's dominance, arguing that we should, and I'm going to use some quotes, be happy to shed this privilege, and that we should, quote, dethrone King Dollar. And so I'm trying to understand if you seem to believe that China would be better off if this were to happen. I'm trying to understand where you are on this point right now. Do you think that the United States would actually be better off if the dollar were to somehow lose its status as the world.
Definitely not, Senator, but I certainly understand the references you're making, and I apologize if there's confusion there. What I was trying...
I'm not confused. I'm just trying to understand what...
Well, I think you're actually not quite capturing what I was trying to get at there, so let me try to explain
Please explain.
it to you. Yeah. The benefits of having the reserve currency are, as we've discussed, and we could go on to elaborate those benefits. There are costs as well, particularly when other countries with whom we compete, China back in the 80s and 90s to some extent, but other countries as well, manage their currencies in order to have a trade advantage against us. Now, from this very dais recently, Senator Vance asked this question of Chair Powell, to the extent to which reserve currency status can strengthen the dollar and disadvantage our manufacturers. What I was trying to do in those writings was to explore both sides of the issues, the very solid benefits that I think you and I agree on, but also the costs, which I think we too often ignore, particularly to our manufacturers.
I understand the issue of the cost, but in terms of the strength of the benefits and the strategic value, I certainly know where I stand. I'd like to know where you stand in terms of the weight of this. Where would you stand on balance, and where will the Biden administration be?
So I share your view on the importance of the dollar as the dominant reserve currency.
Perfect, because I think that's an incredibly important tool, particularly as we look at what China is threatening to do with respect to Taiwan. We look at the incredible debt that we piled up and the cost of interest that is, the interest rate cost, which at CBO is projected to actually be greater than our entire defense budget.
Senator, if I may make one point, because we are in agreement here, one thing we could really do to help both the dollar maintain its reserve currency status, but also to protect the value of the dollar would be to raise the debt ceiling. I think having that kind of default out there as a political tool is antithetical to what you and I are talking about right now.
I think you just need to finish the sentence. We need to raise this debt ceiling at the same time that we begin to get our fiscal house in order.
Agreed.
Because the fiscal spending is, I think, going to let the market dictate what happens to the dollar as a reserve currency. And if we continue to allow deficit spending to go out of control, I very, very seriously am concerned that we do it to ourselves. I know China would like to do it to us. China would like to see us lose our status as a reserve currency, but I think the biggest threat is from within by allowing our spending to get out of control. That's the path that we're on now, and we need to see it back under control. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Harry. Senator Menendez from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bernstein,
Tell us.
I have a couple of questions for you. First of all, I appreciate the even-handedness that you have approached issues over a long period of time. I think you're inclusive of everybody's views, and I think you've taken positions that are rather centrist in terms of trying to make sure that we get to the right place. So I appreciate your history. The Federal Reserve's most recent semi-annual monetary policy report stated that the United States continues to face a dire labor shortage, 10 million unfilled job openings. Now, certainly companies can and should make jobs more attractive by improving pay and workplace conditions, but the report goes on to note that this is primarily due to a wave of retirements and low population growth. At the same time, we have immigrants ready and willing to fill these jobs. Over 1.6 million immigrants still have pending work permit applications before USIS, and over 8 million immigrants are stuck in the broader visa backlog, talking about legal immigration. Would addressing these visa backlogs help alleviate labor shortages in the job market?
Thank you, Senator. Not only would they, but we've tried to take measures to help address that. When it comes to employment-based immigrant visas, we've approved more than 172,000 in FY21 and a record 280,000 in FY22. Similar advances have been made in H-2B. But I very much agree with the spirit of your question.
Yeah, well, even the leading business groups and labor unions agree that robust immigration reform is urgently needed to address our labor shortage, and creating new legal pathways to do exactly that. We have Republican governors calling for parole for certain immigrants to do part of the jobs that they just simply cannot fulfill. I'm for any American who wants to do any job, regardless of how significant or how lower the skill set is. But in the absence of finding any American to do 10 million American jobs. We need productivity and growth, and this is an opportunity for that. Let me ask you, one of the great successes I view of the Biden administration has come from focusing on issues of importance, immediate importance to hardworking families, from emergency rental assistance during the pandemic that helped keep people in their homes, to the expanded child tax credit that helped lift millions of children out of poverty, to the unprecedented funding provided by IIJA to restore roads, bridges, public transit systems, and other critical infrastructure projects that Americans rely on. But many hardworking Americans are still struggling, and the costs of goods, key goods and services such as housing and childcare remain high. If you were to be confirmed, you will play a key role in keeping and helping to shape the Biden economic plan moving forward. It's important to continue this focus on kitchen table issues. If confirmed, what would be your strategy to suggest to the President for continuing to deliver economic aid directly to middle class, working families, and those struggling to get into the middle class?
Well, this is, of course, as I know you know, Senator, core to Bidenomics and core to the values of President Biden, who grew up in precisely the type of middle-class family, often facing the very struggles you define there. So yes, if confirmed, one of the ways we would continue to press on this would be the implementation of the measures that you described. I mean, again, I've worked for President Biden for a long time, and implementation means a lot more to him than I think to many others in very high office, all the way back to 2009 when he was the implementer-in-chief of the Recovery Act. So implementing the Inflation Reduction Act to make sure that insulin costs, that the benefits of lower insulin costs, capping that at $35 a month, the benefits of prescription reductions in prescription drug costs, the benefits of lower costs for clean energy appliances, all of those, electric vehicles, electric cars, all of those are going to be implemented under President Biden's guidance in a way that I think is consistent with your question.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Borzakowski, Dr. Borzakowski, let me just echo Senator Warren's concerns about the Office of Financial Research. It was reduced by 50% in staff. Recent events in the banking sector, not to mention longer-term problems like the growth of digital assets and the implications they will have on the financial system, make it all the more important to ensure that all members of FSOC, including OFR, are fully staffed. So I just want to echo that if you are to be confirmed, you need to work to accelerate hiring and bring OFR back to its full strength so that we can have faith in the information that we need generated to understand these complex issues. Is that something that you're committed to doing?
Senator, as I think I mentioned to your colleague, I'm fully committed to making sure that the resources are there, both in terms of staffing and data, to fulfill the mission that Congress has given the OFR.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Tillis of North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to all of you on your nomination. Mr. Weggio, I watched your opening statement in my office and would like to apologize for the challenges that some of your family members here in what I consider to be a dark chapter in our nation's history. But Mr. Bernstein, I want to start with you. You previously supported the concept of a financial transaction tax in the U.S., and I believe at the time you argued it would bring revenue and dampen trading volume you believe should not exist. Now, we know that Sweden tried it and repealed it. We know the EU debated it and determined that it was going to be a loser, and I think the CBO said that it would have about a $43 billion first-year impact, net loss on tax revenues, and assets would immediately depreciate. So I know that a part of your motivation in a blog post in 2015 had to be a way to tamp down spoofing, which we know is illegal. So that would be the way to wipe out high-frequency trading. You still support that position?
Thank you for the question, Senator. We actually have a few factual disagreements, if I may, respectfully. So first of all, I believe the CBO score over 10 years of the financial transaction cost was in the fairly high hundreds of billions. I think it might have been
It
700
said,
or 800.
my information said it's a $43.9 billion first-year net loss in tax revenues, and it would immediately lower the value of financial assets.
So we can certainly follow this up. I believe the 10-year score was around somewhere in the 700 billion in terms of revenue.
Why would an FTT in the United States defy the trends of Sweden and the
so that's the other
assessment of the EU?
That's a very good point. So the first of all, I do not currently support or am not working on a financial transaction tax.
Okay, good. We can move on.
But wait, no, but there are some utilities to that tax. So the Swedish tax was very badly designed, and we actually have a financial transaction tax in this country already, and it funds the SEC. So we have one here.
But your position, at least as it was articulated in 2015, is moderated?
Yes, I am not currently working on an FTT.
Well,
nor is our administration.
I guess maybe the only other question, because I'm thinking about how trading has changed so much and how many retail investors there are today, do you feel like the FTT in whatever form or revised form would actually be beneficial to that block of traders?
Beneficial?
To grow their wealth?
Oh, yeah. I do think that the damages of very high-speed trading, particularly when servers are co-located, really we haven't done enough to look into that and to ameliorate it. Now, I don't know if a very small FTT would be a good solution to that. I suspect you and I could have good conversations about that, and if confirmed, I'd like to do so. But that would be where I would land at that right now.
Okay. I want to move to another area. I, for one, in the 8 years that I've been here, have seen a major shift in what I consider to be the politicization of certain financial regulators. And in fact, now I think that from where I sit, the Fed is the only one that seems to be trying to keep consensus as the top priority. We saw what happened with the FDIC. But just on Fed independence being a priority of mine, I'm concerned about some of your past writings. And as a neutral institution, I just want to try and figure out where you are. You've worked for President Biden for a long time. I would assume you share his priorities.
I do.
You've probably been in an advisory role to actually formulate some of those priorities. So as a neutral institution, should the Fed base policy decisions offer prioritization of one race over another?
No.
I'm trying to figure out then, as you're aware, full employment, you know what full employment is a function of aggregate inputs. Yet I believe you have a proposal out there to pair aggregate economic numbers against cherry-picked data sets. I'm particularly thinking about minority unemployment numbers that being mixed in with the aggregate. It seems like that could distort decision-making. Do you agree or disagree with that? What are you attempting to achieve with that position?
So I'm not exactly sure what you're asking about, but let me just say that you and I would agree on, and more importantly, President Biden would agree on the absolute critical independence of the Federal Reserve. I think what I would like to see, and then consensus and the FDIC, the SEC. If I had an opportunity, I'd talk about fast and loose rulemaking under the APA, but I'm absolutely. I agree with you in terms of independent regulators critical to what we need to do here. I think what I was trying to communicate in some of the things that you're talking about there is the benefits to minorities of full employment labor markets. And so as we speak today, the black unemployment rate of 5% is the lowest on record, going all the way back to 1972 when we started collecting that data. That is very much a function of just how tight this job market has been for so long, and it's a tremendously important benefit. You know, Senator Scott earlier talked about hand-ups, not hand-out. I think this is extremely consistent with that aspiration.
I'm going to close out, but just to me, it had more to do, rather than maybe cherry picking. I'm trying to understand how you can, fly at 30,000 feet with certain numbers, and then how you would normalize any sort of level of granularity, and then reconcile that with what are macro
Great
level
question.
numbers.
If confirmed,
Please be brief.
I would be honored to sit with you and explore that question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, until Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized from her office.
Thank you, Chair Brown and Ranking Member, and congratulations to all of you, Dr. Bernstein, Dr. Borowskowski, Mr. Green, and Mr. Oegio. I'm very glad to be with you virtually this morning, and look forward to supporting your nominations. I'd like to focus my first question on the interplay between higher interest rates and home ownership. So Mr. Oegio and Mr. Green, higher interest rates are raising barriers for home ownership, especially for lower income households, and this hurts people of color who own their own home at much lower rates. Demand for home buying has gone down as the Fed has raised interest rates because obviously higher rates make home ownership less affordable. And in most markets, including Minnesota, prices are still up year over year, further diminishing the purchasing power of working families. So Mr. Oegio and Mr. Green, what steps can we take, should we be taking to promote affordable home ownership in an era of higher interest rates?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Senator Smith. And, if I were confirmed to lead the Office of Fair Housing at HUD, my principal nexus would be between this phenomenon of decreased housing affordability, largely driven by a huge shortfall in supply, and any implication or violation of the Fair Housing Act. I think the best thing we can do from that perspective to protect the vulnerable communities you've just described is really try and keep people in their existing housing. We don't want to exacerbate this problem through unfettered evictions or foreclosures. And so if I were confirmed for this role, I would look carefully to see any nexus or interaction between that phenomenon of housing become increasingly less affordable and any violation of the rights of individuals protected by the Fair Housing Act.
Thank you. And I would like to just reinforce one thing that you said, which is that I agree with you that the crisis of a shortage of housing supply, especially for lower, priced homes, is a huge contributor to why we have such a dramatic disparity in home ownership rates. But Mr. Green, would you respond to my question too, please?
Absolutely, Senator. It's such an important question, and the Secretary is committed to expanding homeownership in this country, and we know the importance of homeownership as a wealth-building tool. We don't control interest rates at HUD, of course, but the loans provided by the FHA are such a critical tool to and pathway for building homeownership. Earlier this year, the FHA took an important step of lowering the premiums for the mortgage insurance premiums that will put, on average, $800 back in the pockets of FHA borrowers. So I would emphasize that HUD and FHA are doing everything we can to protect homeownership as a pathway to wealth building. And I would also echo Mr. Oegio's emphasis that it's also connected to supply issues. So it's not just access to affordable mortgages and responsible mortgages. It's also the fact that this nation is facing a tremendous housing supply shortage that is driving up the costs and putting homeownership out of reach for too many Americans. So that combination is, in my view, the winning combination to address the issues you raised.
So speaking of this, I'm increasingly hearing from Minnesotans about institutional investors buying up single-family homes and also manufactured home parks, especially in rural communities. So one large private equity fund has purchased hundreds of homes around North Minneapolis, which is a predominantly lower income and diverse community. So taking affordable homes off the market and turning them into permanent rentals, thereby reducing the supply of affordable home ownership. And these large institutional landlords often have a terrible record as landlords, leaving their tenants in sometimes even squalid and dangerous conditions. And as I mentioned, this is happening in greater Minnesota, though it's more likely to be institutional investors buying up manufactured housing communities. And as you all know, it is often cost prohibitive or physically impossible to move a mobile home. So folks are experiencing higher rates, higher lot rates, and then the communities are also deteriorating. So Mr. Green, what impact does this purchase of manufactured communities have on this, and institutional investors' purchases of homes, for example, in North Minneapolis? What impact does that have, and what can we do about this?
It's a great question, and it's one we've actually taken a hard look at. In the Office of Policy Development and Research, we recently hosted a quarterly. We brought together local policymakers, researchers, advocates, and others to take a hard look at this issue, look at the data, and published a brief summarizing what we learned. You're absolutely correct. Institutional investors have increased as a share of their presence in the marketplace significantly since the beginning of the pandemic, particularly in the single-family home market and in manufactured home communities. And one of the reasons for that is that institutional investors often have access to ready capital to repair homes. These are often homes that are in need of repair, and they have a competitive advantage over homeowners and community-based organizations. And so one of the things that HUD has already done through the Federal Housing Administration has extended the first look period for owner occupants and community-based nonprofit organizations and mission-driven organizations when properties in the FHA portfolio go into default or foreclosure. So we need to do everything we can. There are many more tools I could discuss to make sure that home buyers and community-based organizations have the first opportunity to purchase homes that institutional investors are currently purchasing to preserve homeownership opportunities for everyone.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Daines of Montana is recognized.
Great. Chairman Brown, thank you. As we've been watching this hearing today, just was curious coming back to this issue of Keystone Pipeline, Dr. Bernstein. You refused to say whether you recommended shutting down the Keystone Pipeline or not. Would you just clarify you don't recall, or did you make a recommendation, or what are your thoughts? And by the way, the Keystone Pipeline enters Montana first. 1 million barrels a day of oil from Canada, huge creation of jobs, $80 million a year of tax revenues to impoverished counties in eastern Montana, a gut punch to so many families in Montana. Here's a chance for you to clarify your position on it.
So two things, Senator, and thank you for the question. First of all, I do not recall being part of that decision. And secondly, I think it's important to recognize—
If you would have been part of the decision, what would your recommendation have been?
I can't speculate on that.
What do you think about it now? Should we reopen it?
I think this was my second point,
sure.
So Senator, respectfully, I think the important point here is the domestic production of traditional forms of energy and under which our administration has the top track record of any presidential administration on record, 11.6 million barrels a day, considerably higher than the previous administration, higher than any other administration on record, as we also plot a course to more renewables.
So you are incredibly pro-oil and pro-natural gas. More.
Exactly,
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So why not—
In the following, but let me, if I
Sure,
can please
you
finish.
bet.
Yes, as one step of a two-step and critically important second step process, which is traditional sources of energy must be accessible and affordable today, in today's America, and we must continue doing everything we can to build on the success of our administration in achieving that goal. As we plot a course to more renewables over the longer term, and there you see some of our legislation, which I think has been instrumental in that goal.
So if we need more oil right now, as you just said, why shouldn't we permit the Keystone XL pipeline?
The Keystone pipeline doesn't create more oil. It transports oil from one place to another.
In the least carbon way possible, because a pipeline generates a lot less carbon than by rail or by truck, so why not use a pipeline?
So again, Senator, and I'm happy, if confirmed, to get into
I don't believe
but
that you're going to
the Keystone
be
pipeline
advocating.
does not produce more oil.
It moves more
The
oil.
Biden administration produces more oil. The Keystone
it's laughable to think the Biden administration is somehow pro-oil and pro-natural gas and pro-coal. when the world is going to need 50% more energy in the next 25 years than it needs today. My concern is not about adding more renewable energy to the portfolio. My concern is about using it as a replacement strategy of traditional sources of energy. You don't burn your existing bridges until the new bridges are built. It's very dangerous. Spend time talking to the Europeans right now about what it means to shut down baseload power of nuclear, of coal, to watch the Lithuanians to shut down a nuclear plant because the EU said that we can't follow the same green hallucination that your administration is pursuing right now.
You know, obviously, I would disagree with the hallucination characterization, but I think that when it comes to the first step of this two-step process, you and I probably have a lot to talk about and hopefully agree on. I mean, the president approved the Willow project, which I suspect you very much support. That will produce 180,000 barrels per day.
That's cherry picked. If we, I mean, it's laughable to see how they're taking a few small examples to somehow try to cover up a very radical green agenda. Let me ask you this. In 2019, you mocked $60 barrel oil as totally inconsistent with sustainable growth, I'm quoting you, and a threat to climate change. You also expressed support for the Green New Deal and the job-killing policies it would impose because the Green New Deal publicly promotes, quote, social justice and, quote, health care, while, quote, plotting a complete destruction of traditional energy sources. Do you still believe that low oil prices, which my farmers and ranchers need and my low-income Montanans benefit from, or inconsistent from your economic goals and a threat to enacting radical green new policy? And it's important because the position you're looking to be pointed to.
Thank you for the question, Senator. It's an important one. And yes, I would hope that the spirit of my comments, and you know, I very much disagree that there's anything cherry-picked here. I have a table here that I'm happy to share with you that shows thousands of barrels per day pumped by
Have you ever asked the producers? We brought the producers in here right now and asked them if they think you're this pro-oil.
If I may, our large publicly traded oil producers have made $36 billion in profits in the fourth quarter of 22, $162 billion over the full year. That is by far a record. So I think I'm telling you a story where oil companies are more profitable than ever and pumping more oil than ever on U.S. grounds as we plot a course to more renewable.
Right. In your op-ed, you said, so what's not to like about $60 barrel oil? Well, there's the fact that it's melting the planet. You said that's hyperbole meant to get your attention, but the fact is that cheap oil is totally inconsistent with sustainable growth. I finally reject that notion, trying to explain that to hardworking Montanans and Americans right now who want to see lower cost energy.
I think the point of that writing, which as you read it back to me, sometimes the context gets lost. The point of that writing was supposed to be, we need to do two things at once. We need to walk and chew gum. Walk, in this case, means affordable, accessible, traditional energy sources for Americans.
Wait a minute. Walking and chewing gum, when you say cheap oil is totally inconsistent with sustainable growth, I wouldn't call that a balanced
Well, I think that is inconsistent with the points that I've been trying to make here today, where I've been telling you that under President Biden, we have a very strong record with oil companies highly profitable, and we're pumping more barrels per day than ever as we plot a course to more renewable energy. So I think we have to do both. I hope I conveyed that in my piece, and if I didn't, I ask you.
And now the edict coming from the EPA that's going to require that nearly 2/3 of vehicles are electric by 2032. I wouldn't exactly call that a friendly strategy.
Well, that's the chew gum part of the equation. I think we have to make sure that we have affordable, accessible, traditional sources of energy in the present and in years to come, while we plot a course to electric vehicles, charging stations, and the kind of investments that we make in the Inflation Reduction Act and other pieces of legislation.
Thank you, Senator Daines. Thank you to the witnesses. This committee, as we know, as we wrap up, has traditionally agreed the president should have his choice of CEA chair. I work closely with Senator Crapo on Kevin Hassett's nomination, someone whom I didn't generally agree with, but he was President Trump's pick to lead CEA. I voted for Mr. Hassett, confirmed by the Senate 81-16. Senator Toomey voted for Cecilia Rouse, your predecessor. She was overwhelmingly confirmed 95-4. Long history that CEA chairs get voted out of the committee, and the floor is strong bipartisan support. I've held up this letter already of the 6 or 7 former Republican nominated CEA chairs who support Dr. Bernstein. I hope my colleagues will follow the tradition of this committee, not fall victim to the distractions and rhetoric we've heard today, Dr. Bernstein is clearly qualified. Economists from both parties have agreed we should confirm him. Finally, let me address other nominees. Dr. Borzakowski, Mr. Green, Mr. Uggio will have all have the experience and qualifications for the positions they've been nominated for. There have been efforts to distort their views and qualifications. It's evident they should be confirmed. Thanks to the nominees for being here. I hope we can work together as a committee to move forward quickly on these nominations. For senators of both parties who wish to submit questions, those questions are due at 5 p.m. this Friday, April 21st. To the nominees, we'd like to have your responses in less than a week from then, Thursday, April 27th at noon. Thank you again for your testimony. Thank you for your desire to serve our country. With that, the hearing is adjourned.